All right. Hey, Tammy, our first time at this format.
Yeah,
Yeah.
glad to be here.
Today, we're going to be talking about budgeting, which is a topic that is near and dear to your professional interests, and that's budgeting, right? That's something that you're really keen to advise on, and both with our clients and also just talk about with our team on. And I, in preparation for us to talk about this, I reviewed a blog article that you have in process, and when we kind of get that blog article squared away, we'll have it on our website for our viewers, so we'll point everyone out to that at a later point. But I guess I'd like to start with just talking about how you first got into budgeting, why this is a topic of interest for you, and what got you there.
Yeah. So I got into budgeting long before I even thought about business. So back in high school, I actually was that person, or that child that would actually create a financial budget for myself, just in terms of how many hours did I have to work at babysitting, or when I was working at a Subway shop, how many hours I had to work in order to get a certain amount of income, and then how, what I was going to spend with it on. And so I really got into budgeting just from that perspective at first. And so when you say it's near and dear to my heart, it is for many reasons. Luckily, I found a profession when I joined and started doing accounting and finance, where budgeting is a big portion of business in terms of being able to plan and for resources and for the next kind of year. And so really got to sharpen my even more kind of passion for that and my tool set in terms of how to develop budgets for companies.
From a financial leadership perspective, I definitely agree that budgeting is a key topic. It's super important, right? But of course, there's other aspects of financial management, financial leadership. Why does this topic stand out to you in particular?
Yeah, so I think that in terms of when you think about a budget, and it's a tool for companies to plan and to not just even plan in terms of how profitable are they going to be, but plan for what resources they need to support their strategic plans, to support their business growth, support operations, or in a declining business, it could be to help understand what that actually means in terms of how, with limited resources or declining resources, how are they going to be able to budget or manage for the next year or so. And from a leadership perspective, really having your insight and building that model or that budget really does help kind of shape the operations going forward for that period of time.
So can you actually do financial leadership? I mean, can you be a financial leader in an organization if there isn't a budget?
Wow. Yes, I think you can in a lot of ways. It makes it challenging. I think that you're without having a budget in place or developing a budget or communicating against a plan, because when we talk, let me just take a step back. When we talk about budgeting, we're really just talking about a plan of operations. And so if you think about a lot of things in life, you have to have a plan. So and this becomes a very financial numbers plan, but it is a plan to help the organization kind of operate. And so I would say that to be a good leadership in financial kind of activities of an organization, you do need to have a budget. If you don't have a budget or you don't have a plan, and either you're operating on something that's in your mind and you haven't communicated it out, and so that therefore it's going to be harder to align a company and have the company achieve a plan, or to be able to understand what is expected of them, that I would say it probably does make it a little bit impossible, or maybe not impossible, but challenging to lead or be a financial leader without a plan.
Yeah. And I kind of hear you using those terms, plan and budget, interchangeably. And I think that's definitely was a question for me when I was looking at the draft of your article, is that, I always talk to clients about planning. I don't necessarily go down the road of talking about budgeting. Sometimes I do, though, because clients don't know what I mean by planning, but they know what the term budget means, right? But the reason that I go there is because I guess my thought process is usually very like lender, investor forward, as opposed to management operationally, kind of as my initial point of getting into something like that. I think from hearing how you talk about it, I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to go ahead and throw it out anyway, in the sense of, is there a difference? Like you and I work together, so I think you have some sense of what I mean when I talk about a plan or a planning model. Is there a difference between what you think I mean by plan and what you mean by budget. Is there actually a difference, or are they really just the same thing?
They're really, in my view, they're really the same thing. I think that a plan sounds better in terms of a lot of people can think about a plan and they think more optimistically, or thinking about, oh, here's what I want to do, or here's the estimated kind of plan or where we're going to go. And so it's softer in a lot of sense.
Yeah.
A lot of times when people hear the word budget, they think of budget cuts. They think of here's what you can spend and that's it. It's not necessarily thinking about the overall strategic plan. And again, I say plan a lot, I guess, in this sense, but they aren't thinking about not just in terms of spending. It's like, what can I spend versus what am I planning on spending to achieve a better result, right? So I think that because budget and the history of budgeting just sounds so negative or governmental or limited, that a plan in my view, is usually a better word to use in order to kind of to rally the troops and to achieve that plan.
Sure. Yeah, the other kind of term that's kind of thrown around in this space that I am careful with, and I kind of get your feedback on this, but is forecast. Mm-hmm. And the reason I'm careful with that is because I think sometimes it's like trying to reinforce with the clients and the teams that I work with that, the plan is coming from our business plan. We're translating it into a financial plan. Mm-hmm. And that plan it is a correct use of the term that plan does then have a forecast of what will happen if you successfully enact the plan, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that sometimes the psychological trick that happens is when people start talking about it purely in terms of forecast, is they think about it like predicting the weather instead of accepting responsibility for the fact that, no, we're planning here. We're not just like predicting what we think will happen due to externalities that are going to land on us. Mm-hmm. We're actually planning for something to happen. This is what will happen if our plans come to fruition. Yeah, have you thought about that or seen that in that kind of thought process in action?
Yeah, and I think that what's interesting about that is a lot of times people see things as a budget or a plan to say, here's what the numbers, should be, or here's what we're trying to achieve, and then it's set. And then a forecast is something that as things change, you're just like the weather changes, you're forecasting for the next month, the next 2 months, 3 months going forward. I think that what's interesting about that is some people may not think about how do you measure against the forecast then? Like how do you measure those results? Because what you don't want to do is have and this would be the same for a budget plan, forecast, any of those things, but you don't want to have this really out of unrealistic kind of view and say, oh, well, it was just like trying to predict the weather. We don't know what's going to happen, but we forecasted it was going to be way higher, and then, oops, it didn't, and not kind of learn from it or think about how do I shift the next forecast? How do I kind of continuously revisit that future plan?
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess, for our purposes here, I think, we're aligned, budget plan, we're talking the same thing. So, mm-hmm. in the draft of the article, you make a case for the varying reasons why planning or budgeting would be important, why mm-hmm. it's important. I'd like to hear from your experience in terms of, okay, we know mm-hmm. from our professional experience why budgeting is important, but what's actually the most common motivation for small businesses that you see, mm-hmm. when they actually fire up a budget for the first time? Mm-hmm. What's actually, I guess I'm leading the question here in the sense that I doubt it's all the things that we know and that you kind of are listing in the article, or it's maybe some part of those things. Which one of those things is most commonly the actual motivation for an operator based on your experience?
Sure. Typically, it's going to be because they're required to. There's a lot of times where someone will, like for funding purposes or investor purposes, people will say, I would like to see what your budget is. I want to see what you're going to have. And so they'll say, oh, well, we don't have a budget, so what do I need to do? And so a lot of times in that case, it's used as not a tool, but it's used as to comply with a request from their lenders or their investors or things of that nature. And so it becomes a little bit more of a compliance situation, which then it's challenging because part of that is then you start looking at what your budgets are compared to your actuals. And if you are kind of setting up a budget that you just did to hurry up and get it done for some other reason, and you're not going to utilize as a tool to help manage and operate the business, then it doesn't become as meaningful in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess building on that point, if the organization is throwing a budget together to meet some kind of external compliance requirement, do you think that the external, the consumer of that budget, if they did it to your point and they're not really operating the business by it, it's just something they did for that external requirement, do you think I've always thought about this, and I've wondered, I'd like to get your thought, do you think the external consumer kind of knows that they can sense it, or they have a sixth sense for that's what they're getting?
I think probably not at the start. I think that they will start seeing that because typically what they'll do is they'll say, go ahead and give me your budget. And then after Q1, let's look at your budget to actuals. And then if you can see this kind of mismatch of information or large variances that kind of come up and there's not a good explanation behind it, they'll start to sense that. I do think that probably someone who has, asked for a budget a time or two and got kind of oh yeah, we'll have that for you in, a couple of days or a couple of weeks, and then they're scurrying on. And when you see the results, it doesn't make sense. I think you'll probably start to see that. So yeah, I guess I'll take it back. I do think that they'll probably sense it a little bit, but the proof is in the pudding when you actually see budget to actual results and seeing what the variances are.
Sure. Yeah. But I guess in line with that, excuse me. The easiest route, or what we'd probably say best practice, would be to have an operating budget that you actually do run the business by, that you can use for external parties, not to wait and just create it for an external party.
Correct. Because I think what ends up happening is for a lot of companies, I would see what happens is that they're in the middle of a year, for example, and they're seeing significant growth, and then they're trying to scramble either to provide the resources for that growth. And then that's when they'll say, oh, well, we should probably look and see what are we expecting, because a lot of the times, especially if you're growing an organization, there's a lot of things you have to do in advance in order to, if you're making widgets, to make that widget, right? So like if you're planning on sales doubling, then you have to start to think about, well, what am I going to need to do to build up for that inventory levels or for that sales? What kind of sales structure or team do I need to be able to do that? So sometimes I do, more progressive, I guess, operator would say, I'm going to start planning now because I know it's going to take a lot of investment in order to get to that next result. Even if I'm not asking, from a vendor, from a banker or from an investor, that I need to know how much money I'm investing in my organization before I start going too far. And so then I would say that they would start to really utilize that budgeting tool or that thought process because they're trying to plan for a significant growth.
Sure. So your article the draft anyway, is doing a great job of outlining some different options for budgeting. And so, when we get it up there, I'll encourage our audience to really take a look because you talk about the different kinds of budgets you can have, as well as methodologies for getting that budgeting process going. But when I was thinking about, as you outlined the different types of budgets, kind of similar to my last question, it's like, okay, we know there's different types of budgets that are useful for different circumstances, but I suspect in practice, you probably see it actually happen most commonly one of those ways, or more predominantly one way more than the other. What would be the most common practice that you see in terms of the type of budgeting?
The most common that I've seen is the activity-based budget of kind of setting out the targets of whether it's going to be, I'm going to have revenues be at this amount. And so then if the revenue target is this, what activities do I need to spend in order to achieve that revenue? And so there's that kind of, top-down approach and then bottom-up approach in terms of how to achieve that. There is another one that I would say is probably top. There's probably two. It's a lot of times you'll hear the zero-based budget where it's like, you start at zero, you can't spend anything, and then every person is kind of setting up to the point of saying, here's the cost that I need to spend for the next, period of time, which is usually a year, and here's the reason why I need to spend it, so that way I can, achieve the X, Y, Z. And I say that, those are two definitely different approaches, but usually I would say if you're doing an activity-based budgeting, you're kind of setting that same kind of zero bottom line for, spending rate first, because you're saying, okay, well, here's a target, here's what I'm going to need to spend it. And so you're still justifying those costs. So I always kind of combine them a little bit together. But I think the other one I would say So it's kind of hard to say there's just one. So, but the third one I do see quite a bit is going to be the incremental. And I would say that that is probably a common one because out of just ease. So basically what that's saying is, here's what I spent last year, and I'm just going to apply a 5% growth. I'm going to assume inflation's going to go up, so all my spending is going to go up by 5%. I'm going to assume that because my sales team's awesome, they're going to go up by 5%, and it's just like a blanket percentage. So while those are the most common one, you'll probably see in the article that I go always towards the activity-based one because it seems like that it actually is, again, planning for the business in the next 12 months versus just applying a growth factor that may or may not come into fruition.
Yeah, and I imagine that when you see these different ways of doing budgeting, that it isn't the categorization of exactly what type of budgeting is being done is not that strict, in the sense that there's probably hybrid approaches where people are doing different ways of doing it for different parts of their budget or their planning models.
Yes, and I think I would agree with that, and especially what ends up happening too is a lot of people will say, okay, here's kind of what I did spend on, from the past 12 months, and I can kind of see I know what my salary is going to be, my payroll expenses are. I know what certain, categories are, but then they are kind of, adjusting it for sometimes it is going to be an inflation, so they're going to want to adjust for that, but then they're also going to be like, oh, but I know that I'm also going to expand my team because of a different type of target. So in that particular case, you're using all three component pieces of those budgets and marrying them to one.
Mm-hmm. In our last episode, we had AJ. We were talking to AJ about nonprofit grant management. I'm curious how you see the budgeting process at nonprofits. Is it different than what we've been talking about in the small business environment?
It can be. I think that's an interesting question on that because in some cases, one thing is some grants will require a budget in order to apply for that grant or get that grant funding. So in that particular case, you're budgeting for a particular program that's very, laser focused on like what resources are you going to need to achieve that program so that they will give you the funding for that program. The processes could be the same though in terms of thinking through if I'm achieving, if I'm going to do this program work, what are the resources, what is the planning that needs to take into place in order to achieve that, and what am I asking for? So in that case, you're really developing a plan or a budget to justify the cost that you're going to get, or in its cost in that sense, but the funding you're going to receive from that grantor type of situation. I think in those cases, nonprofits, especially if they're being funded by grants or contracts, they know what those buckets are, so you can do the same type of budgeting process. I think what could be a little bit different than from like a company or a for-profit company is thinking about growing. If you're a selling company and you're selling, or a manufacturing company and you're selling, again, widgets of some sort, you can say, here's my 10 customers, I'm going to go into that territory, I'm going to increase my sales and kind of build going that way. That can be a little bit different than on a nonprofit where they're really doing funding for grants and are fundraising for dollars too. Like it is a little bit different in terms of how do you target, how do you reach those targets that you're looking for?
Sure. Talk to me about who in the organization should own the budget.
It should be those who are going to be responsible for their budget. So I would say in terms of the management team, the people who are operating within the departments that are spending and utilizing those resources, they should be owning that process because they're basically owning the spending of that. And therefore they should have input to that. Hopefully you're going to get to that question. But I would say that those who are having to manage against the budget need to have ownership of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and I guess in terms of when we talk about ownership, it's who, well, let me ask that question. I ask that as if you and I both understand and our audience all understands what I mean by ownership of the budget, but maybe expand on that point. What do we mean by owning the budget?
Yeah, so the way that a budget usually is kind of developed is you have various different departments that say, here's my plan for the next 12 months. And in that, so I'm going to utilize I'm probably part of the finance team, so I'll have a finance team budget in terms of I know I'm going to have my accounting team salary, payroll expense. I'm going to have supplies. I'm going to have software licenses, all those types of things. That would be my department, and I'm going to manage the spend of that department, and therefore I should develop the budget for that particular department. And you can go, HR would have one, marketing, sales, you kind of manufacturing. You can go on and on and on with that. What I would say is a lot of times, to kind of flip this around a little bit, a lot of times what you'll hear is it's the accounting budget. So because it's finance and it's numbers and it usually rolls into a financial statement, oftentimes you'll hear, well, those are not my numbers. Those are the finance numbers. Those are what the finance team says I can spend, or that's the finance team's budget. But I would take that away because although the finance team will probably help create and provide information, provide, rolling it up into a financial statement view and all that jazz. They're not the ones that are managing and operating on those budgets. So they don't have ownership of that whole entire process, so therefore it's collective. It's the department, it's the team, it's those who are living and breathing and operating the company and are spending against those numbers.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I think in my experience, I always cringe a little bit when I'm working with an organization and it is the accountants or the finance team that is presenting the budget or trying to tell the story about what happened with actuals versus the budget. It seems like in my view, and I think that sounds like it aligns with your view, that the department leader should be in charge of that story, and that the finance team is there to support it, provide the data and support it, maybe help them with crafting it if they need the help. But it's really the department leader's story, not the accountant or finance professional's story.
100%. And I think that is what's challenging, because a lot of times the financial statements, or even like a month-end review, for example, it's really driven, a lot of times it's driven by the finance department, because they're like, here are the results of the business, which is in the numbers and all that stuff. But what is probably would be beneficial for an organization and educational, for their teams, is to share and understand what do those numbers mean. Because yes, they're, financial metric or their financial numbers, and they provide information to develop the financial statement. But if you actually take it down piece by piece, we're talking about, again, departmental ownership and spend, and what their trends are and what their results are. And so they are the better, to be able to provide the story of what happened. Because a lot of times, and I've seen in my past, where you get to a month-end review and you say, oh, I spent, I'm going to just make big numbers here, but $10 million more than I was supposed to on something, which is huge. And then they'll ask, accounting, what happened? Like, how did you spend that amount of money? Or, what happened with your numbers? And it's like, well, accounting may not know what that $10 million spent. I mean, they probably process the vendor, the AP invoices and all that stuff. But the people who are approving that spend and made the decision to spend that amount are the departmental leadership folks that would actually know what happened and why they spent that amount of money.
Right. Yeah, I think and I think maybe building off of that, I think the question I want to close with before we bring our panel up is I think we're trying to encourage those organizations that don't even have budgets to consider getting a budget and a plan in place. But just as much as that's the case, we also have worked with plenty of organizations that have a planning or budgeting process, but it doesn't quite work, right? And so I wonder if you could speak to that in terms of what are the most common, what would be the most common way that you see that planning, budgeting process go wrong? For organizations that already have a process, but it's just gone wrong, what is the most common thing we see there?
Yeah, so I'm going to give 3 because I like the number 3. The first one I would say is using the budget as, instead of a tool, using it as a weapon. And I say that in a way to say, if you have a kind of a predetermined amount that you think you're going to spend, so going back to the negative term of budgeting versus a plan, but saying, here's the amount of spend that you have, and then the actuals come up and you spend over that amount, and then all of a sudden it becomes a very argumentative, blaming type of situation where it's not, you're like, oh, you went over budget, and versus the questioning as, why did you go over budget? What was the rationale? Can we change that spending going forward? Can we use this information as a tool to help the business go forward? So what I would say in that case is, the wrong step would be to to look back and to use it as something to penalize somebody for versus understanding why and what does that mean for the future spend. I think the other kind of common thing to make a budget not go well, or the budgeting process not to go well, is allowing the right amount of time and review and input of developing that plan. So again, and we talked a little bit about ownership, and when we hear, and I've heard this throughout my career many times, of like, those are the accountant's budget, that's the accounting's numbers, those are not my numbers. Well, they should be your numbers. If you're going to be held accountable for them and you're managing against them, then you should have the process of to provide the inputs into that budgeting process. So that being said, that all takes time. So you're going to need to have the right amount of time to develop a budget, to understand what the plan is, and to kind of to build resources and spending and plans around that so that you have a better sense of where the organization is going, and to utilize it as a plan. And I think the third thing in terms of where I've seen kind of budgets go wrong is kind of being either too optimistic or too pessimistic. So I think one of my famous stories from when I was developing a budget many moons ago was I left it pretty open. I said, why don't you guys, sales guys, let me know what you think your sales are going to be for the next year. Let all the department heads let me know what your spending is going to be. And it was interesting. The sales numbers were all down. We were going to decline in sales, and then our spending for all departments went way up. And so all of a sudden we were a profitable business, but it showed that we were going to lose a lot of money because people wanted to pad their budget, either like not having such an aggressive sales plan, or make sure I got enough approved expenditures, and and not really thinking about what that meant holistically for the company.
Sure. Yeah, well, thank you. I think this is, it's been fun and definitely engaging for me to kind of exchange some ideas about budgeting and planning. You and I have talked about it many times before, but I think it's been a little while since we've really talked at this level in depth about it. And I'd like to get our panel up here and kind of hear their thoughts and questions on what we've been talking about.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Hey, we're back, everybody. Thank you. Yeah, it's good to see everybody back again. Another week, another round of this. I guess we liked it the first time we did it, right?
Right.
Yeah. So the two of you, AJ and Charlie, were hanging out in the background while Tammy and I were talking budgeting. And so, I think it'd be great to kind of hear some of your thoughts from our conversation. What came to your minds about the topic?
Yeah, I want to air one grievance with Tammy, because when she was mentioning she was putting together the budget for her accounting team, I heard no mention of New Year's Eve party, because accountants are always working, December 31st to close the books. No pizza party in that budget. I just, I don't know. I fell flat on my ear when I didn't hear that in the conversation of the accounting budget.
Yeah, there was no T&E either.
Yeah,
right?
no.
Yeah, so,
They were cut from the budget.
Yeah. So I'll just remember, if I'm ever in an accounting team with Tammy, that I really need to push for my pizza parties and T&E,
Exactly. 100%, yeah.
No, actually, I wanted to, you guys kind of touched on nonprofit budgets, and I guess, and that's where a lot of my experience on this lies, is through the nonprofit budgeting process. And what I really wanted to ask about was, or at least explore, was the kind of year-long budget that they do. The reason why so many nonprofits have budgets is because it's required. It's a requirement. So because it's a requirement, they often look at it like, 10%, we'll just increase everything by 10% and let the chips fall where they may. And if it's way off by, 6 months from now, whatever, we'll tell the board why, and, we'll move forward. It's not looked at as and it drives me nuts, because, as an advisory firm, and spending time with Ty and you that really do this forecasting, model planning, whatever you want to call that, working budget that is that business plan. It's infuriating, because it's kind of like, they put it together, they throw it out. So I guess my question is, and you kind of alluded to this when Ty was talking with you, is there's those three types of budgets, and how you can better, I kind of know the answer to this. The driving force in a nonprofit is usually the person, employees is what drives revenue. But I guess suggestions for building a budget that's responsive to actually what you think is going to happen, and the planning around that, and how to go about the steps of implementing that,
Yeah. So usually the way I would go about that is to provide a template. So to say, here's by month, here's all your GL codes. And I typically would say, here's what you did spend. I mean, looking backwards in terms of the historical numbers does provide some, good insight as to what you think you're going to spend. Now, what I would say is a lot of times, to your point, I've seen people who say, just apply 10% because I'm going to spend 10% just because it's a good number. I don't know, but what I would challenge folks to do is when they do kind of look in that, really think through what they're going to spend by month, by those different type of categories, and really kind of plan as to if they were going to be asked to justify those costs, why that they're spending those amount of dollars, because and look at timing, because I think a lot of times what I've seen, the mistakes that I have seen when trying to just do a blanket budgeting approach is to say, okay, I know I'm going to spend $1 million in T&E because apparently people like Christmas parties and things, and it's going to be $1 million, but I'm going to divide it by 12.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
Well, then that means every month you put in this little dollar,
Yes.
actually a big dollar amount, but if it's for an annual party, it's not going to be, straight lined over a 12-month period. So like narrow it down to close to what you think it's going to be. And I think that if you, and this would be for nonprofits or for any type of a department, if you think about it, kind of isolating it down or kind of shrinking it down to where your area of control is, it's easier to actually think through that process and to really to think about what are you planning on spending and what do you need to spend, because that's the other way to turn this back into a positive versus a compliance requirement, or like someone's going to beat me up if I overspend or something like that, is to think about, I want to be able to make sure we have the cash resources for this spending, because I'm going to have a summer party, but I need to make sure I have the money in the the summer months to be able to do that. So that's where I'm going to forecast or budget this plan for this amount of spending.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on, because I know that, a lot of times people will plan out a year, and then as the year goes on, things change. And so there's kind of there's two mindsets. One might say we're going to get our year plan in place, and we're going to look at how we do towards that goal and constantly revisit it, and just kind of maybe feel bad if we're not on target or whatever. And then there are other businesses who will look at their budget and say, things are way different. That means every month we need to be coming up with a different plan for what would happen next month. That takes into account all the things that have happened in the months leading up to it. Where do you fall on that spectrum in terms of long-term budgeting like that versus dynamic, repeated each month style budgeting?
I love that you brought that up, because that's actually a good paragraph in my in the blog article. Is typically I would say you have your budget that you plan for, so it's kind of set in stone, it's approved. That's kind of what you guys are planning on doing. I think usually what I would say is you don't change that just because things are changing, but you have a budget that's in place. However, because things do change, I think you should have what is often called like the latest view or a forecast or the next kind of living plan, so that you can adjust for those, because sometimes what you'll find is it's maybe it's not significant, but there could be a customer that you thought was going to buy something or purchase something in the third month, but instead it's been deferred and needs to be shifted down. But then you need to allocate all your other kind of spending that gets up to that accordingly. So you would have this more latest view type of version, and then you can start in a way comparing to what the newest plan is, the newest latest view, the newest forecast. And then you can also there's still some good, information of still comparing it to your budget, because what did you originally plan? Because in any kind of situations for a company, they should be able to not only want to measure against what they planned, but understand what caused them not to achieve or exceed. I mean, we're always talking about going, exceeding or kind of going over budget or under budget or whatever. But it could be positive if you had higher revenues than what you planned for. That's a great thing, as long as you had the resources in order to be able to fulfill it. Now, what I will say, there are some cases where it is justifiable to just say, hey, this budget that we made like 2 months ago was completely outdated because a significant thing happened, a change in business, a change in ownership, a change in funding, so something really, really significant could cause you to say, we can't even look at this old budget because it's not even close, and there's no benefit to like continuously comparing it, and we should re-scratch it and let's change it going forward.
Toxic budgeting. When the way you brought it up in terms of Charlie, the way you brought it up in terms of yeah, we have a static budget and we just pull it out every month to remind us to feel bad, so that we can just all feel bad, right? And that was, when Tammy and I were talking, was toxic budgeting, was that your term or did I just make that
You
up?
just made it up, but
Oh.
I
What
said
was your term?
Use it as a weapon.
Using it as a weapon.
Yes.
Okay. Weaponized budgeting.
That's
Yes.
a good one too.
Yeah, I mean, and I've seen that too. I mean, and luckily I haven't been on the other opposite end of that, but I've had many, monthly business reviews with departments, and they, what showed up on the screen was, here's what I budgeted for, here was my results, and then a bunch of red, right?
Yeah.
And then the department manager they felt like they were being interrogated, and they're like, well, I overspent in Staples because of, XYZ. And then it didn't help the conversation, because whenever I think of, and this could be a different conversation for another day, but when I think about when you look at monthly results in an organization, I always believe that we need to understand what happened. What did the results, what does it say? Like, how well did we perform in that current month? But what I always love to turn the conversation about is, where are we going in the future? So if you think about it that way, it's like, okay, I may have had a really crappy January. It may have been horrible. Do I anticipate that happening going forward? Are there things that I can do to change that outlook? What can we do to think about going forward versus beating ourselves up for the past? We need to learn from it, but we also need to figure out where is this going to go going forward.
Yeah, no, I had a question about that, and actually, time I get this right. So I worked at a company a long time ago, so they would spend every budget meeting arguing about what the most minute numbers were in the model that we were looking at, and so what I had suggested was there doesn't need to be that much detail this was a very detailed budget look to actual look that they were arguing about, and so you would get into arguments over $60 of something, So my question is how detailed, I guess, when looking, a GL, for profit and loss can be a mile long. And what's kind of like the rule of thumb on how you would like to see that presented, especially at a high level, right? I understand from our level, we want that to exactly match the GL code. So, on the back end, it's very easy to update that budgeting model. But from a presentation view, or to, kind of back off weaponizing it, or even having toxic conversations about minute details that you're missing the forest from the trees here.
Yeah, so I would say there's two ways to answer that question. The first way is to develop that information. I do think you need to be a little bit more granular, but I would say if you have a $60 account account, and that's the only thing that's in it, maybe roll it up to something else. But I would say it is very detailed level at the person who's managing it. But by the time you're actually reviewing it and comparing actual results against it, or thinking about the forward view, or presenting it to a team, it should be a higher level. Just because, to your point, not even just to the fact that you get too caught up in the details, but how do you want to change that conversation? What is the purpose of that conversation? And so in that kind of example that I was telling Charlie about, where we had department managers that were sitting there, trying to justify every single one of their costs. It wasn't as detailed by GL, but it was still broken down by their particular department. And this company, we had, 30 departments that were going over, everyone had their own slide. Well, we rolled it back up because from a group conversation in terms of where is this company going and how do we want to review the results of the organization, we summarized it very, very top line. But if we need to go down and talk about certain things, we could at least talk about that in a conversation versus showing, here's your budget actual results. So you'll need both, but at the same time, I would say trying to figure out what do you want to have the conversation about? Do you want to have the conversation about why you spent $40 here or $30 here, or do you want to have a conversation about, is this helping the company meet its targets? Is it helping the company, whether it's to increase sales, to reduce costs, X, Y, Z, like where do you want that conversation to go?
Yeah.
I have kind of an interesting question. Let's say you're at a company and they've been profitable in the past, so they're not in any kind of like growth type phase or anything like that. And then they all sit down and they try to make a budget. And once they put them all together, it says they're going to lose money, which is not really anybody's individual goal, but that's what the plan as it's laid out currently says. Do you feel that at that moment, are you done with budgeting at that moment? Or is it true that that company should keep working at it until they have a plan that actually has them making money? I guess another words, what is really the purpose of the budget? Is it to ensure that you're not going to lose money, or is it to ensure that we've all communicated the actual plan? Because I've been in those meetings, right? I've been in a plan where they sit down, they look at what they've got, they say, I think we're going to lose money next month, and we're noticing it, we're calling attention to it with the budget, but we haven't actually made substantive changes. We just expect that's what will happen.
So I guess I'm going to change your question. Is it okay to budget for a loss?
Yeah, that's really what it is.
Yeah, and I would say it's not great, but if that is what the plan, if that's what the numbers show, what I would say is that could be realistic, because there could be a time where the company is planning for a loss because they're going to have an investment in resources, and they're building something for a future plan. Or it could be also to say, hey, this is what the plan shows, unless we do something different. And so, what can we do in order to change that and have that kind of conversation? So I would say that you can plan for a loss, you can budget for a loss. I think depending on what kind of organization you are, it should inquire conversation in terms of what are you going to do about it? Is that okay? Because if you were to say, if Ty was investing in my company and I showed him my budget, I'm like, I'm going to lose $1 million. I really have no plan on fixing that. That's what I'm going to do. He may say, I don't want to invest in your company. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Or if I said, hey, here's where I am right now because I plan on losing $1 million in year one, but that $1 million is going to invest in my future, and I'm going to make $30 million in year two. That might be a different conversation, right? And he might be more willing to invest in that. So I think it's hopefully worth the conversation versus a doom and gloom, throw in the towel.
That's what we call a SOPMA budget. SOPMA? Spending other people's money?
Oh.
Budget?
Well, I think with that.
Well, yeah, I think, I mean, this topic, it seems like we probably could keep discussing it, more. So it's probably worth another round. I mean, I think maybe we can inspire Tammy to give us a little bit more in a future episode, right? You guys think so?
It will definitely be a good topic always, because it always comes up.
I love budgets, and I've even done a similar presentation to my niece and nephew on a couple of personal budgets conversations. So
I'm all about it.
Aunt Tammy's the fun aunt. Yeah.
I am. I even have a template for personalized
There you
budgets
go.
if you'd
Hey,
like to see it.
send it my way. Send it my way.
All right. Well, you heard it here. Okay. Well, thanks everybody. It's been good to get together, and looking forward to getting together again next week, and we'll sign off here.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.